To a brand new hour of America's Newsroom, I'm Sandra Smith.
And I'm John Scott, in for Bill Hemmer. War hero, public servant, president, and great American. President Bush, 41, is about to make his final journey to Washington, D.C. He will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. Matt Schlapp remembering President Bush earlier on America's Newsroom.
He taught the American people that it's not your job title or your resume that make you who you are. It's the gifts God gives you and how you use them and how you impact others. I think he impacted more people across the globe than maybe any political leader we've ever had.
Fox team coverage. Britt Hume will be joining us in just a moment, but we begin with Casey Stegall live from Houston this morning. Casey?
And Sandra, good morning. We are anticipating this to start happening any time, really, because we've been getting notes from the pool producer. In other words, the person out here handling and sort of coordinating this coverage for all of the networks, telling us that the family members have been told to be ready about 15 minutes earlier than expected. So we're starting to see more activity picking up back here. We showed you this picture about 30 minutes ago in the last hour of America's Newsroom, but we want to show it to you one more time because you see the hearse right back there, and there has been a lot of activity, members of active military walking around. You have a very heavy police presence here with the Houston Police Department. This is the Lewis and Sons funeral home. You know, we stood in this exact spot just about 8 months ago. This was the same funeral home that handled the arrangements for former First Lady Barbara Bush. But what we're going to see happen here about 10:35 Eastern, 9:35 local is when we were told that we would see the pallbearers emerge from the chapel carrying the flag-draped casket. And those pallbearers, by the way, 6 current members of the former president's Secret Service detail. And so they are supposed to emerge from the chapel carrying the casket to the hearse. And speaking of that casket draped in the U.S. flag, boy, talk about a picture that has broken the internet. It's hard to even look at without welling up. Look at this picture. Talk about man's best friend, Sully. That is the former president's service dog, a Labrador that he got once his beloved Barbara passed away earlier this year. And this dog can do everything. He has his own Instagram page, 33 different commands, can open doors, can pick things up for you. And this has been the president's companion, we understand, just man's best friend. And that dog not leaving his side, laid out right there on the floor of the funeral home in front of the president's casket. So a lot of moving parts to this. Once the casket is loaded into the hearse at the funeral home here, then that is when the motorcade is going to begin, and it will leave this location and it will head to Ellington Field, where Air Force One is waiting, the plane that's used as Air Force One, and that is where it will be loaded up. There will be a small ceremony there, and then wheels up, headed for join Andrews Air Force Base.
And today,
so
because
we'll stay here, we'll bring it to you.
And today, because Air Force One will not be carrying the president, that will be Special Air Mission 41 carrying the former president. Thank you very much, Casey Stegall.
Yeah.
Joining us now for more on the life and legacy of President Bush, Bush 41, Fox News senior political analyst Britt Hume. I know you have met a lot of presidents, covered a lot of presidents. What are your memories of President George Herbert Walker Bush, Britt?
Well, I have many because I covered his campaign in 1980, and then again in 1988, and then I covered his presidency as a White House correspondent. And you know, he was a gregarious man, friendly to reporters, easy to be around. And I think my favorite story about him is actually one I never knew until earlier this year. And it was told to me by Dr. Charles Neblett, a very, very good friend of the family, with whom the Bushes, through the years, were accustomed to watching the election returns with at their home. And picture the scene, John. It's 1988, election night, and then Vice President Bush and Mrs. Bush are at the Neblett's home to have dinner and watch the election returns. And the election returns came in, and the word came, and the call was made that George H.W. Bush was going to be the next president of the United States. His vice presidential motorcade was waiting outside for him to whisk him across town to the George Brown Convention Center, where the victory celebration was waiting for him. And his first act was to help clear the dinner dishes. To me, John, to me, that is so like him. And I posted that yesterday on Twitter, and a guy up in Canada, who I guess is a hunting guide, posted a photograph of President Bush on a hunting trip, in which he's helping to carry the coolers full of the lunch that had been brought into these guys out in the wilderness by helicopter. And the writer of this tweet said that he was the only one who helped these guys. But there he is, you see him and his hip waders, walking along, helping to bring and that's really kind of how he was. I mean, for a man who grew up in such privilege and served in office at such high levels, he was in many ways an extremely polite, considered, and humble guy. And that is the quality about him that I think those of us who knew him a long time remember so vividly.
Great stories, and if you'll stick with us, we want to get some more of them in just a moment, but somebody else has some interesting stories about the former president. We want to go to that now. Sandra?
Joining us now by phone is President Bush's former right-hand man, Vice President Dan Quayle. Mr. Vice President, thank you. It's an honor to have you on the program this morning, sir. And I know
Good morning.
Yes, good morning to you. If you could look back at your time spent with the former president, a man you came to know so well and worked so closely with.
Yes, I was very blessed. One of the real benefits that I had compared to other vice presidents is that George Bush had been vice president for 8 years. He served Ronald Reagan very effectively, very loyally. But he also knew the good things about being vice president and the not so good things about being vice president. So that was very helpful to me. But as all your folks have said, and Britt was on there earlier, he was a man who had a deep caring for the people that weren't as fortunate as he was. But on the other side of that, I know a lot of people have talked about his humility and modesty and things like that. But he was also inside very tough. I saw him worked with him during the Gulf War. He was the toughest and the most focused of everybody. And you look at it throughout his career, I mean, he was always a winner. So there was a certain toughness, but he had great respect for other people. He had a love of life. He loved, obviously, his wife and his family. And he was, just to put it succinctly, absolutely the best.
And together you faced so many challenges. What was the biggest challenge to the former president during his term?
Well, on foreign policy, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And he was clearly the very decisive leader. I mean, we were all around giving him advice that he would listen, but he knew what to do, and he knew how to do it. He knew the world. He knew the world better than anybody else. He knew all the leaders. His biggest challenge probably came on the domestic policy. He was in Congress for 2 terms, and I was in the House and the Senate, and we talked a lot about dealing with the Congress. But that was probably the biggest challenge. I remember after being successful in Desert Storm, we said, okay, now what are we going to do about the economy? And it was a challenge. But, he had a lot of accomplishments. The Clean Air Act, the Disabilities Act, budget. We funded the government during a very, divisive time. And don't forget, we had a Democrat Congress. We had Democrat control of the House and the Senate. So in those days, we reached across the aisle and worked with the Democrats as hard as we worked with our fellow Republicans.
Of course, he promised during the convention, read my lips, no new taxes, and then signed a tax increase, perhaps to mollify the Democrats who were running the House and the Senate. Is that what cost him re-election, in your view?
Well, it didn't help, but no, I don't think so. Look, that situation, just to put it in perspective, we're going to Desert Storm. It was the fall that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. We were focused on what we're going to do there. He had to keep the government going. He knew he had to compromise. He did compromise. He knew that it was going to not be helpful to him in his reelection because, that very, dramatic moment at the convention on, read my lips statement. But I think what really probably was the nail and the final nail in the coffin was Ross Perot got 19% of the vote. And here is a Republican businessman from the president's home state garnering 19% of the vote around the country. That's very difficult to overcome, and we didn't.
Mr. Vice President, if you could take a moment, finally, to look back at the man that you came to know so well as a family man. We're remembering him as the former president and a former military man this morning, among so many other things. But it seems, hearing the stories from those who knew him best, he was truly a family man. As it was, he was a father and a beloved husband.
Well, let me just give you one little anecdote that will stay with Marilyn and I as long as we live. This was after the election in 1992. We had lost. And a couple of days afterwards, my 3 children received a handwritten note from the President of the United States telling them that how proud he was to serve with their father. That was so touching and so revealing in a time that, he obviously wasn't feeling the best. He'd just been defeated. He took time out to console my children. We'll never forget that.
Wow, that's a remarkable story and a special one as well. Former Vice President Dan Quayle, it's wonderful to have you on the program this morning, sir. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Let's get back to our conversation now with Britt Hume. Britt, our brain room does such wonderful research. Every president makes history in his own way. But it had been since 1836, Martin Van Buren, when a sitting vice president was elected to the presidency to follow the man he'd been serving with. George H.W. Bush did that, and it was, as has been pointed out, one term, but it was a consequential one term.
It was a consequential one term, and it has struck me many times, John, that it was often said of Bush that he really didn't have vision of where he wanted to take the country, that he lacked what he himself used to refer to as the vision thing, which he would say somewhat dismissively. In fact, however, I think it's correct to say that what happened on his watch was vision that had been held by many people in leadership positions for many years came to fruition with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a moment of great opportunity and hope, but also one of great peril. It was not guaranteed that would end well. It was not guaranteed that chaos wouldn't erupt in Europe as a result of that. And President Bush's sense of things was to be very careful in how he reacted to that. I'll never forget the day the Berlin Wall came down. I was there at the White House, and my CBS News colleague Leslie Stahl was banging on about where is he? Why isn't he out telling us? Why isn't he reflecting the joy of the nation and indeed of the Western world that this has happened? And Bush steadfastly refused to come out and say a word. He was not in any way going to appear to rub it in or to be gloating over the victory of the West over the Soviet Union. And he later was able to develop with Mikhail Gorbachev a strong working relationship. His relationship with Helmut Kohl in Germany was a huge factor in bringing about the reunification of Germany. I noticed that Angela Merkel in the last couple of days has called him one of the fathers of German reunification. So he was in many ways, with all his diplomatic experience, his personal friendships with world leaders across the globe, these things came into play at the right moment with him, and he turned out to be just the guy to manage this victory, which was very important. And then, of course, later, as Dan Quayle has noted, we had the Gulf War, and his ability to string together this huge coalition of countries to include even Syria, then governed by an utterly vicious dictator named Hafez al-Assad. He even got him to play in the thing to keep it from being to get some Muslim countries into the coalition, which he managed to do. And that, of course, that war was a total success, a complete walkover. It lasted only a matter of days, with very light casualties on the coalition side. So, I think he turned out to be the right man for the challenges that met him when he was in the office.
Brett, it's Sandra. Finally, if I could show...
Hi, Sandra.
And hello. I wanted to show this exchange with Chris Wallace and the former president about sending troops into combat and what that was like.
It's got to be the hardest thing for any president to send troops into combat.
Oh, it's the toughest decision a president makes, no question. Nothing compares with it. When you send somebody else's kid, somebody else's son, somebody else's daughter, whatever it is, into harm's way.
And on a personal level, how do you live with it?
Well, you, with all respect, you pray, and you rely heavily on a team of experts, but in the final analysis, you live with the decision. And sometimes things worked out great, and sometimes I was very worried they wouldn't. When you suit up to be president, that goes with the territory.
Remarkable to look back at that exchange, Brett.
Yeah, and it's I so well remember, Sandra, and it was Thanksgiving of the year of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraqi forces. And the United States and its coalition partners were massing forces in the region. We had bases out in Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia and from which to mount an attack to liberate Kuwait. And there were ships at sea. And the president went over at Thanksgiving to be with some of the troops. And those of us who covered him had watched him very carefully in the run-up to this. And a lot of people thought he was bluffing, that all of this was just a big bluff to get Saddam Hussein to turn tail and leave Kuwait. Those of us who were watching him so carefully during that Thanksgiving was out first on a ship to do a Thanksgiving dinner, and then out in a remote base in Saudi Arabia. Awful place, sand in your hair, sand everywhere, outdoors, and you could see and hear in his voice the emotion he felt about being among these soldiers. We didn't know for sure how that war would turn out. We knew the Allied forces were going to win, but we had no idea, nor did he, how many casualties the United States forces would take. And he's out there among these men and women, and he didn't know how many of them would come home. And he was obviously clearly emotional. This was not the behavior of a man who was bluffing. And the thought you heard reflected in that exchange with Chris, I think, was exemplified in the way he behaved and acted and seemed that weekend.
Amazing stories and great perspective. Brett, thank you.
We're going to take a live look now at the Houston Funeral Home, where we await the departure of the casket that will carry the body of former President George H.W. Bush, heading to Washington one last time as America says a final farewell. Tributes to the 41st president continue to pour in.
And our friendship just got better. And
okay. So I went down, I was sitting down there and just kind of taking it all in. And in walks Dad. So Andy had told Dad that I was down there, and he walks in and I said, "Mr. President, welcome." He said, "Thank you, Mr. President." And that's pretty much all that was said for a while. And it was a very profound moment for me.
That's former President George W. Bush reflecting back on the day he was sworn into office. His father, President George Herbert Walker Bush, will be laid to rest this week. In just a few moments, the casket will be leaving the Houston Funeral Home to board a special flight to Washington, D.C., where he will be lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda until Wednesday. Wyoming Senator John Barrasso shares his memories of the elder Bush. He remembers him as a kind and generous man, saying, "Everyone got a smile, everyone got a handshake." Senator Barrasso is our headliner today. He joins us from Capitol Hill. Your memories, Senator, of President Bush 41, so similar to what Britt Hume just described, a very gregarious and friendly man, but it seems that sometimes that did not translate to the American people at large, and that may be what cost him re-election. Do you agree? And if so, why was that?
Well, it's interesting, and I think it translated very well to anyone he was with in person, but maybe not as well on television. Brett was just talking about that run-up to the war against Saddam Hussein and the troops at Thanksgiving. One of my operating room nurses from Casper, Wyoming, was a soldier on the ground there when President Bush was there on that Thanksgiving. And she said just being with him, you gained confidence, because you knew that he was in control, so you were in control. So one-on-one and in person and with groups, with individuals. I saw it when I was with him in Wyoming, in Casper, as well as in Jackson Hole. He was, a man of great courage and great character. But you're absolutely right. It was much better in person than it was sometimes on television.
Speaking of courage and maturity, I mean, an 18-year-old pilot in the U.S. Navy, perhaps the youngest pilot in World War II, shot down and yet went on to, after he was rescued, went on to fly more combat missions. This was a man with nerves of steel.
Well, it really was nerves of steel. And, when they dedicated the ship, the George Herbert Walker Bush ship, I was there for the dedication in Virginia, and they had kind of a current day plane flying by, and the same kind of plane that President Bush had flown in the war flying by, and it just seems so slow and so small and so fragile compared to what the men and women in uniform have today. So the technology has changed, but the courage of President Bush has never been lost, and we've really lost a great leader in President Bush.
We're watching right now as Neil Bush, the president's son, is heading into the funeral home. It's our understanding that he will be there at the hearse as his father's body is placed aboard. John Barrasso, senator from Wyoming, thanks for sharing your memories of the late president.
Thanks, John.
Well, as you can see, the family is starting to gather there in Houston. The departure ceremonies are about to get underway as the nation honors the life of the 41st president. We will be joined by Bret Baier, Britt Hume, Brad Blakeman, Karl Rove, and many more. Join us again right after the break.
He was the very best one-term president this country's ever had, and perhaps one of the very best.
Field. That should be taking place a short time from now. We're going to pause and bring in our other Fox stations. This is Fox News coverage of the death of President George H.W. Bush. I'm Sandra Smith in New York, along with my colleague John Scott. We are awaiting some of the initial pictures of the Bush family at the funeral home there in Houston. Before the president then will be carried out via his casket, and then a motorcade will be off to Ellington Field. Air Force One, which today will be Special Air Mission 41, will then carry the body of the president to Washington, D.C., where the former president's body will lie in state for 2 days so that the public can say their official goodbyes to Bush 41. As we await all of that, it's going to be a very special several days of honoring the late president. Let's bring in Bret Baier, anchor of Special Report. Bret, as we await this live look here, we know that the relatives accompanying the casket will include his sons, former President George W. Bush, as well as Neil Bush. Ahead of that, how are you remembering the former president this morning?
Well, Sandra, a lot of thoughts. Really no politician anyone looks back at was more polite than the 41st president of the United States. Also, perhaps no one more prepared to be in that office after 8 years as vice president, CIA director, envoy to China, UN ambassador, and congressman. Obviously, a lot has been said about his life since his passing Friday night, but really the most poignant remembrances are little moments where they talk about his humility, his ability to connect, his ability to write a letter to someone feeling going through something tough. And more of those stories have come out of the past couple of days. Today is special in that he'll be making the transit from Houston back here to Washington, D.C., and there will be a ceremony this afternoon in the Capitol. And I'm sure that will be emotional, as well as a formal goodbye for a lot of people here who spent a lot of time working with him. This has been a long time in the making. It's not like no one, didn't expect this. At 94 years old, a lot of preparations have gone into this moment, and the Bush family is treating everything as they often do, by the book at the moment and as they planned it.
You mentioned the fact that he served 2 terms as vice president under President Reagan and then was elected himself to the presidency, the first president so elected in more than 150 years from the vice presidency. But, a lot of people feel, Bret, like Americans were sort of tired of the Bush-Reagan term at that point, and that that is part of the reason he did not win re-election, that there had essentially been 3 terms of a Reagan presidency, and Americans were ready for a change.
I mean, that's possible. You know, the American electorate sometimes does that. The pendulum swings. I think that he will probably be looked back as one of the most successful one-term presidents in the country's history, both on a foreign policy front, obviously from the transition with communism and all that happened with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall and how he transitioned there, but also the first Gulf War and the economy. A lot of people forget that a big part of the economic discussion was saving the bank system. He had a major effort to save the thrifts, if you remember, and because of that, had to go back on that read my lips, no new taxes pledge. The recession hits, the election comes, and even though it had largely opened up and finished before the election, he took a hit, and Bill Clinton won that election.
All right, so this is some of the images that you're starting to see here. We know that that is the former president's 4th child of his 6, Neil Bush, along with his wife, Maria, and others are following as we await the first look of the former president's casket as they'll leave the funeral home there and Brett eventually make its way to Washington, D.C., where the public will have their opportunity to say their goodbyes.
Yeah, just one quick moment that is viral as you wait for the casket to come out there. That dog is Sully, the service dog, and there's a picture of him laying down in front of the casket. He's been with President 41 in his illness, and now will make the transit with him to Washington, D.C.
And as we know, once the casket leaves the funeral home there, it will travel via motorcade along with some of the family members. And there's a couple other buses that will be carrying the other family members. They'll make their way to Ellington Field. And then, of course, Air Force One, Special Mission 41, will carry the former president to Washington, D.C. The former President Bush will lie in state in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol from Monday, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That's tonight. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan just tweeting about that, and a picture of where that casket will now be headed for 2 days. He will lie in state until Wednesday, 8:45 a.m. And at that time, he'll be transported to the National Cathedral, where the state funeral will be held.
Those pallbearers are members of the former president's current Secret Service detail. As you know, a president is entitled to Secret Service protection for life, and President George H.W. Bush had a Secret Service detail right up to the end of his life, and it is members of that detail who just placed his casket in the hearse.
It's remarkable to look back at these family members, Brett, as we await the casket. Neil, obviously you can see front and center in the picture there, along with his wife, Maria, and fascinating to hear some of his children speaking. Neil, in recent days, saying, I don't want this to be a sad time. I want to look back at my father's life as a celebration. And of course, many looking back at the fact that he and his wife, they wanted to go be with their daughter that they lost at a very young age. And he will be buried next to his wife and his daughter.
Yeah, another viral image that we've seen over the past couple of days, that cartoon of the reuniting of President 41 and Barbara Bush and Robin. Notable, as you mentioned, John, about the Secret Service detail. If you want to know something about the Bushes, ask the people who worked in those jobs, the Secret Service agents on the detail, the people inside the White House during Vice President Bush and President Bush's time. And they will tell you to a person that they were really respected by the Bushes, and President George H.W. Bush in particular went out of his way to just check in, say hello, and really identify with the folks who were working for him.
Brett Baer. Brett, thanks. We'll check in with you in a bit. Our Fox News senior political analyst, Britt Hume, joins us now. Britt, he'll be, as I understand, the 35th person to lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda. That is a tremendous honor, obviously. It has not happened all that often in this nation's history.
No, it has not, and it is a moving tribute. because of the grandeur of the Capitol and the feeling the nation has for the man. It's interesting, John, as we watch this hearse pull away, that the president said, you know, he kept an audio diary, a recorded diary, which we were able to use for a special we did some time back that actually aired again the other night. And it was on election night, 1992, and he was talking about how terrible he felt about having failed for re-election and being seen as a failed president. And at the time, John, I think it's reasonable to say that that is how he was regarded by some, and perhaps by many, and certainly for at least in that moment of defeat, by himself. But that is not how we're looking back on him today, is it? I mean, people are, we go through it and recount the achievements and the successes of administration, especially in foreign policy. People are regarding him differently. And of course, in this tumultuous and angry age in which we live, his personal temperament has shown through to people, I think, his dignity, his grace, his kindness to others, and so on. It reminds me of when Barbara Bush's funeral occurred, and her body was lying in the church where the service was to be held the next day over in Houston. And he, President Bush, in a wheelchair, having lost his wife of all those years, whom he so loved, is in the church as the public is filing through to pay their respects, and he was there to greet these strangers as they came through to pay their respects. It was just such a remarkable gesture for him, and it couldn't have been easy. You know, he isn't feeling well. He's old. He's dying, and yet there he was. How like him it was, and that is why as you heard Brett Baer so well reflect, people like the Secret Service detail around him. I remember when he was president, and I would talk to those guys, and ask them, women and men alike, and ask them, what was going on and how it was. And their regard for him was absolutely obvious, and it was clear they would love the man.
A lot of people remember seeing the two of them, Barbara Bush and George H.W. Bush, at the Super Bowl when he flipped the honorary coin flip in 2017.
So the Bush family has boarded those vehicles, Britt, and we are looking at live pictures now of the hearse carrying the casket of the former president, President H.W. Bush, the 41st president. They've left the funeral home en route to Ellington Field, and the Bush family will then arrive there. They'll be joined by President and Mrs. George W. Bush. They will line the tarmac, and they will watch him depart on some of his last trips on board Air Force One, Special Mission 41 today. Brett.
You know, Sandra, I think one of the things we're experiencing here for these few days as we remember him and mourn his loss, we're having a moment really of national unity. And you hear these political figures from both parties, presidents, past and present from both parties. You heard Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and others, Democrats, sing his praises. And I don't think there's anything insincere about this. These people regard for him as not something of the moment, just of the moment of his death. It's the way they thought of him. And for a few days at least now, people are joined, I think, in their regard for him. And we haven't had a lot of moments of national unity in recent years, but I think we're having one now.
Britt, thank you for your time this morning. Hopefully you can stand by as we continue to watch this, the first of many ceremonies, begin this morning. Britt, thank you. We'll bring in Brad Blakeman now. He's the former Deputy Assistant to President George W. Bush and is on the Funeral Arrangements Committee. Brad, good morning to you.
Good morning.
As we look at these live images of the motorcade making its way to Ellington Field to say goodbye to the former president as his body makes its way to Washington.
Right, and we're ready to receive him here in Washington. He will land at Andrews Air Force Base, Joint Base Andrews, and then he will motorcade to the Capitol. There will be a service at the Capitol, starting out with a prayer, some hymns by the Naval Academy Glee Club, and then there'll be 3 speeches, the Vice President, the Senate Majority Leader, and the Speaker of the House, and that'll be followed by wreath layings by all 3 of those speakers, and then there'll be a benediction, and then of course the public will then be able to view and pay their respects in the rotunda all night and all day today and tomorrow, Tuesday, and then early morning Wednesday, and then Wednesday will be the funeral service at the National Cathedral, and then he will fly home to Texas.
We've been talking about the fact that he accomplished a great deal during a single term in office. And a lot of people forget that during that single term in office, he was a Republican president with a Democratic-held House of Representatives and a Democratic Senate. So the things that were accomplished in that time truly were accomplished in a bipartisan way.
No doubt about it. And I'll tell you that bipartisan spirit continues today in helping to arrange the Capitol services and viewing. We've had to work with both sides of the House and Senate, the majority and minority. And I can tell you that every person we've come in contact with has been hospitable. They've been accommodating. The military district of Washington, who is in charge of the entire operation. This is a military operation from start to finish. It could not have been more professional and accommodating to the family. It is a true spirit of America coming together for this remembrance of President 41.
And Brad, the Bush family has had every minute of this final goodbye to their beloved family member. They've had this in place for quite some time, and they do have it planned and organized down to the minute exactly the way he wanted to say goodbye.
Absolutely, and every president gets to put their own stamp on how they are to be remembered. You have a wide variety of options as to the ceremonies and how things are to take place. And President 41, I would have to say, this is exactly the way he wanted to be remembered. Coming back to the Capitol, then coming back to Houston and to College Station, where he will be interred. This is the way that he wants to be remembered. And I think the American people are going to see in the next couple of days a country that comes together. Both Republicans, Democrats, all aspects of American life have great respect for a president who had great respect for them and great service to our country.
Brad Blakeman, thank you very much for joining us on the details of what is a very planned, organized, and honorable send-off for the 41st president. Let's bring in Bill McCurran, columnist for the Wall Street Journal and a former speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush, and Marianne Marsh, former senior advisor to John Kerry. Bill, to you first, your thoughts as we watch the motorcade make its way to Ellington Field.
Well, I agree with Britt that this is a national moment of unity. I think over the years, people have come to appreciate President George H.W. Bush's, not only his achievements in office, but that the virtues that he had, which were so consonant with the man. You know, a lot of people have noted he was born into privilege, Yale, and so forth. But what's less often noted is that the privilege of his generation came with obligations. And I think there's no more moving story than to read when he was still in high school and his uncle, the senator, and the Secretary of War were saying, stay in school. When the war broke out, you know, don't do anything, get your college degree. On his 18th birthday, he signed up for the United States Navy and was at one point the youngest pilot in the Navy. So this was a man that understood honor and obligation, and I think that defined him.
More on that, Marianne. You know, he was in the Navy, was shot down, and survived the shoot down, rescued by an American submarine, went on to fly more combat missions. Then he married Barbara, and at one point he, after graduating from Yale in just 2.5 years, he was apparently thinking about applying for a Rhodes Scholarship, but decided he could not afford to support his wife and his young child, George, the future president. And so he decided not to do that. But again, he came from family money. The family had a lot of money, but he wasn't going to tap into that.
Well, I think it speaks volumes about his strength. And much has been made by everybody in these last 48 hours about the kindness and decency of George H.W. Bush. But he was also a very strong person. And he proved you can be kind and decent and strong. Surviving your plane getting shot out of the sky into the ocean as a young man, you have to be strong. To run multiple political campaigns for many offices, run and win some, run and lose some, get back up and do it again. To run for president is a grueling running marathon, and yet he did that twice. And I would say the end of the Cold War and taking down the Berlin Wall, that took great strength not to give a speech, not to tout the role of the United States in it. So it allowed the reunification of Germany to proceed with peace. And you can see that in Angela Merkel's comments in English the other day, a rare thing by her, and the fact that she's attending his funeral. And last but not least, to forge a friendship with Bill Clinton, the man who defeated him after one term. They put together a friendship, traveling the world, trying to help people get back on their feet and do good things. And it's a friendship that Bill Clinton, I think, cherishes more than any other. And I think that says everything about George Bush and his length of service, his character of kindness and decency, but as a very strong man, too. Not someone who touted his strength. He didn't talk about it. He didn't beat his chest, but his actions proved it every day.
Well, you're looking live at the motorcade as it makes its way to Ellington Field in Houston, where our own Rick Leventhal is standing by. Rick?
Ellington Field is a joint reserve base hosted by the Texas Air National Guard, and today it's hosting Air Force One, which has been redubbed Special Air Mission 41 for this honor today to carry the body of George H.W. Bush from here in Texas to Washington, D.C. It took us a while to get through security here. There's a lot of press on a riser, and there are a lot of friends and family and well-wishers who are gathering here as well, passing through that security line to wait here for the family, for those buses to arrive with the family members on board. And there will be military honors here and a departure ceremony here before George H.W. Bush is on Air Force One, of course, now Special Air Mission 41 for that 3.5-hour flight back to Washington. We can tell you that it's an honor for the folks here in Texas to be handling this, and we have been told that there will in fact be a 21-gun salute. And ruffles and flourishes and Hail to the Chief will be played here. We've seen the band out here setting up and getting ready. We've also seen a couple of photographs via Twitter from the presidential spokesman, Jim McGrath, who posted not just that now very famous photo of Sully, the service dog that had been with President George H.W. Bush in his final months and days, Sully lying in front of the president's casket. Sully will also be on the plane when it leaves here today and will be given to another war veteran's family at Walter Reed. McGrath also tweeted a picture of the socks that the president will be wearing. Of course, he loved his socks, and the socks that he's wearing will pay tribute to his lifetime of service, starting as an 18-year-old naval aviator. Of course, he flew 58 combat missions in World War II. Those socks feature images of 6 jets and smoke trails. So that's what the president will be wearing. We know that the ceremony here will be relatively brief, and then they'll board the jet, and they will take off from here, I believe in less than an hour, about an hour from now. We're about 36 miles from that funeral home, so it's taken about 40 minutes to get here. Then the ceremony will take place, and then they'll head off into the sky.
As we await that ceremony on the tarmac there at Ellington Field, we thank you.
Let's get some thoughts from our Fox News senior political analyst, Britt Hume, joins us now. Britt, you've been quite eloquent, as usual, in your memories of President George H.W. Bush. Give us your final thoughts this morning.
Well, I want to pick up on something Mary Ann Marsh was talking about when she spoke of the president's strength. And what I remember so vividly, John, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the president reacted rather mildly at first, and then as the days wore on, his reactions became stronger and sterner. And I remember the day that he said of the invasion, "This will not stand." And it took my breath away at the time. I thought, how is he going to bring that about? And he did. And what happened during that period, John, was so interesting because he was faulted often for being sort of bumblingly inarticulate and not terribly eloquent. And of course, he had a tough act to follow in Ronald Reagan. But for a period of time, he seemed a man transformed. His public statements to the media were very carefully stated, crisp, articulate, firm, and precise. And if you followed them, as I did, I had to because I was working that beat, you could see in him a steel that hadn't always been evident. And of course, as the world now knows, he was able, by virtue of his diplomatic skills and those of, his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, to assemble this remarkably broad coalition of forces. They got resolution approving the use of force to evict Saddam Hussein's army from the United Nations, and that preceded what turned out to be a very close, in some ways I think disgracefully close, vote in the U.S. Senate to authorize the action. But that was a test of his strength. And it emerged, I think, how much strength he had in him, how much steel, how much resolve, and how much courage, really, because as we talked about earlier, John, sending men and women into battle is a painful experience for a president, and something he had to do and did. Fortunately, of course, the war went well and the casualties were few.
He knew very well the costs of service and sacrifice. Some of his crew members did not survive the shoot-down of that plane that he survived in World War II. So
something he said he thought about nearly every day.
Mm-hmm. Britt Hume, it's good to talk to you. Britt, thank you.
Thank you, Britt.
Thanks, John.
And meanwhile, we await the departure ceremony. It is about to get underway there at Ellington Field. As we await that, let's bring back in Brad Blakeman for his final thoughts. Brad, after this, then he flies to Washington, and the Capitol Rotunda awaits him.
Exactly, and it'll be a time for the Congress to pay their respects to the president, and also a time for the public. We'll have public viewing around the clock tonight on Tuesday, and then it will end around 7:30 Wednesday. So we're going to be able to accommodate many thousands of Americans to pay their respects. But I remember quite vividly President Bush telling us as his staff that no life is complete without service. You can run for office, you can volunteer at a hospital, everybody can do something. And his life is an example of that. And we should remember that no life should be complete without giving something back. And there's no greater example than the example that 41 has left for us.
Brad Blakeman, thank you.
Thank you.
Bill McGurn and Marianne Marsh continue with us. Bill, in your work with the Bush family, I mean, this is obviously, they're often described as a political dynasty, but you can't help from the outside looking in, just thinking that these are, well, it's a very close family filled with people who really love each other.
Absolutely. Sometimes when someone's famous, when there's a story about what they're really like in private life, it's very disappointing that the reality doesn't match to the hype. With George H.W. Bush, it was the opposite. Every private act that he did seemed to be about service to someone else. I remember when he shaved his head because one of the children of a Secret Service agent on his detail was going through some illness, and so in solidarity he did that. And I think there are hundreds of stories like that. I didn't know him very well. I knew his son from working with him, but I met him several times. At one point, my 4-year-old went up to him when he was attending the unveiling of the portrait for his son, and she had a 10-minute conversation with the president. He didn't shoo her away, and I think that there's a lot of stories like that. It's just who he was. The public man was consonant with the private man, and that's an incredible thing to say about a former president.
Bill McGurn and also Marianne Marsh is standing by. Marianne, you heard Britt Hume reflect back on your earlier comments, and really a moment to talk about unity. And this was a president that was able to unify the country, and he is being remembered in that way strongly today.
And deservedly so. I mean, Britt raised yet another point where he showed great strength and great commitment and great steel in his spine. And I think that often got overlooked during George H.W. Bush's life. But I hope in time, as he has always said, that history would judge him. It was not for him to explain or define himself, which is almost unthinkable these days in politics and in life, but he would let others do it. And I hope and I believe that people will appreciate the strength he showed. I think these days, these last 48 hours and the 4 days to come will show the country again what it's like to come to unify, to be bipartisan, to appreciate somebody's service from another party. I mean, believe me, I've worked against both Bushes. And the father in '92 in particular, a worthy opponent every day to the very end of that race. He was a tough, tough competitor. But you can also do good things and do well and do the right thing. And I think this is a wonderful moment despite its sadness and tragedy, where we have an opportunity to show people that that's how things really should be done and could be done again.
Bill, I remember growing up, duck and cover drills because of the fear of nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. It seemed like an impermeable force. And the fact that you can today travel to a country like Poland, which is such a beautiful country and where they love Americans so much, it was not a foregone conclusion that Poland would one day be free.
And the Berlin Wall would come down, which it did on his watch. And he managed that particularly well. Look, the president's life, if you think of it, 94 years, that's almost a century of American history. And I think a lot of us are thinking we've lost something. There was, it was kind of nice thinking there was this anchor out there in George H.W. Bush, that he was reassuring, confident without being arrogant, and, as we've said here, much stronger than he was given credit for. He really was a speak softly and carry a big stick kind of guy. And he spoke very softly, but people that ran up against him, I think, did so at their peril.
Talking about steel in his spine, we all remember when he marked his 75th birthday by going skydiving, but then he followed that up on his 80th and his 85th and his 90th birthday skydiving. That takes some mettle and shows you what kind of man he was.
I'm getting an update from some of our producers here. Fox has confirmed that the eulogists at the National Cathedral for the 41st president will be former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, former Senator Alan Simpson, and presidential historian John Meacham. Will be the 4 eulogists at the funeral service again that will take place at the National Cathedral. What you are seeing right now is the very beginning of the ceremonies, several of them, both public and private, over the next couple of days. But first and foremost, the body of the former president will make its way to Air Force One today, Special Air Mission 41, ahead of its departure to Washington, D.C., where his body will lie in state for 2 days so the public can say their final goodbyes. All right. It is the top of a new hour. Thank you for joining us live in America's Newsroom. You are looking live at pictures of Houston, Texas, where the former president, George H.W. Bush, the 41st president of the United States, his body makes its way to Ellington Field, where it will depart to the nation's capital for final goodbyes from the public as his body will lie in state for 2 days. The 41st president, his family, in that motorcade there as they make their way to Ellington Field, and there will be a departure ceremony. You're about to see honors rendered, 4 ruffles and flourishes, and hail to the chief with a 21-gun salute as an honorable send-off for the 41st president.
I hope you're taking note of the traffic that's pulled over on the other side of the freeway. Houston traffic it's bad pretty much 24 hours a day, but people are pulling over. Even noticed a big rig there just a moment ago.